Welcome, traveller of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. Picture yourself in a dimly lit medieval chamber where a noblewoman sits before a polished metal mirror, her servant carefully applying a paste made from crushed beetles and lead to her face. The metallic scent mingles with the aroma of rosewater as another attendant plucks individual hairs from her hairline with crude tweezers, each pull causing her to wince. This isn't a scene from a horror film. This was simply Tuesday afternoon beauty prep for a wealthy woman in the 14th century. What we consider beautiful today would have horrified our medieval ancestors, and what they found irresistibly attractive would likely send us running to the nearest emergency room. The pursuit of beauty in the Middle Ages was a dangerous, bizarre, and often deadly endeavour that makes our modern beauty standards seem positively tame by comparison. Have you ever complained about the price of your skincare routine? Well, imagine if that routine could literally kill you. Medieval beauty practices weren't just expensive or time-consuming. They were a gamble with death itself, where the line between enhancement and poisoning was razor thin. Women would coat their faces with lead-based cosmetics that slowly ate away at their skin, creating the very blemishes they were trying to hide. They'd ingest mercury to achieve a pale complexion, unknowingly destroying their nervous systems one dose at a time. The medieval obsession with pale skin drove women to extraordinary lengths. Sunlight was the enemy, and any hint of colour suggested you were a lowly peasant who worked outdoors. So they'd apply thick layers of ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, creating a ghostly pallor that was considered the height of sophistication. But this deadly makeup didn't just sit on the surface. It seeped into their pores, accumulated in their bloodstream, and slowly poisoned them from within. The irony was cruel. The very substance that made them beautiful was making them sick, and the sicker they became, the paler they grew, which only made them appear more fashionably beautiful to their peers. But lead wasn't the only dangerous ingredient in the medieval beauty arsenal. Quicksilver, what we now know as mercury, was mixed into various potions and applied directly to the skin. Women believed it would give them that coveted translucent glow. Instead, it caused their teeth to fall out, their hair to thin, and their minds to deteriorate. The phrase "mad as a hatter" wouldn't be coined until centuries later. But medieval women were experiencing mercury poisoning long before hat makers made it famous. The pursuit of beauty also meant enduring procedures that would make modern cosmetic surgery look like a gentle massage. Take eyebrow shaping, for instance. The medieval ideal was a high, smooth forehead with barely visible eyebrows. To achieve this look, women would pluck not just their eyebrows, but also their hairline, sometimes removing inches of hair to create an elongated forehead. They'd use primitive tweezers made of metal, and without any form of pain relief or antiseptic, infections were common. Some women would go so far as to use acids to burn away unwanted hair, leaving permanent scars in their quest for the perfect brow line. Then there was the medieval approach to dental care, which was less about health and more about status. A mouthful of rotten teeth was actually considered attractive among the wealthy because it suggested you could afford sugar, a luxury item that was destroying teeth across Europe's upper classes. Some women would even blacken their teeth intentionally to mimic this look of affluent decay. They'd use a mixture of soot and honey, painting their teeth to simulate the fashionable rot of the sugar-consuming elite. But perhaps most shocking of all was the medieval practice of bloodletting for beauty. Women believed that removing blood would give them a more refined, ethereal appearance. They'd have leeches applied to their faces, thinking that draining blood would reduce any ruddy complexion and enhance their pale, otherworldly beauty. The process left them weak, anemic, and sometimes scarred, but it was considered an essential part of maintaining one's appearance. The tools of medieval beauty were equally horrifying. Mirrors were made of polished metal, providing distorted reflections that made it difficult to apply cosmetics evenly. Combs were carved from bone or wood and often housed lice and other parasites. Perfumes were used not just for pleasant scents, but to mask the odor of bodies that rarely bathed, and these fragrances were often made from animal secretions and rotting flowers, creating combinations that would assault modern noses. Water was considered dangerous for the skin, so instead of washing, medieval people would use dry cleaning methods. They'd rub their bodies with linen cloths, sometimes scented with herbs, believing that water would open the pores and allow diseases to enter the body. When they did use water, it was often contaminated, leading to skin infections that required even more dangerous treatments. The most elaborate beauty rituals were reserved for special occasions, and these could take days to complete. A noblewoman preparing for a royal court appearance might begin her beauty regimen a week in advance. She'd start by ingesting various herbs and minerals believed to purify her blood and enhance her complexion from within. Many of these substances were toxic, causing nausea, dizziness, and worse. Then came the external treatments, layers upon layers of cosmetics, each one more dangerous than the last. Hair care in medieval times was equally treacherous. The ideal was long, flowing hair, but maintaining it required treatments that often did more harm than good. Women would wash their hair with lye, a caustic substance that stripped away natural oils and often caused chemical burns on the scalp. They'd then apply various oils and ointments, many of which attracted insects and caused infections. Hair dyes were made from highly toxic substances like lead and arsenic, and the process of dyeing hair could take hours of exposure to these deadly chemicals. The wealthy would sometimes wear elaborate headdresses and wigs made from the hair of the deceased, believing that incorporating hair from corpses would give them supernatural beauty. These hairpieces were often infested with lice and carried diseases, but they were worn with pride as symbols of status and beauty. Medieval beauty standards also dictated body shape in ways that required extreme measures. The ideal female figure was extremely thin, almost gaunt, with a tiny waist and virtually no bust. To achieve this look, women would tight-lace their corsets to the point where they could barely breathe, sometimes causing their ribs to shift and their internal organs to be compressed. Some would go days without eating, surviving on nothing but wine and herbs, believing that starvation would give them the ethereal, otherworldly appearance that was so prized. The most disturbing aspect of medieval beauty culture wasn't just the physical danger, but the complete lack of understanding about what these practices were actually doing to women's bodies. There was no concept of germs, no understanding of toxic substances, and no awareness of long-term health consequences. Beauty was literally a matter of life and death was often the price paid for following the fashion trends of the day. Based on the reference scripts and the summary of your first part, here's part 2 of Why Beauty Routines Were Strange in Medieval Times. Now, if you thought lead-based face paint was the worst of it, you'd be sorely mistaken. Medieval women didn't stop at poisoning their faces. They were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to achieve what they believed was the pinnacle of beauty. And some of these methods were so bizarre, so dangerous, that they make modern beauty trends look absolutely tame by comparison. Let me tell you about the medieval obsession with pale, almost translucent skin. This wasn't just about avoiding a tan. Medieval women wanted skin so pale it was practically see-through. They believed that if you could see the delicate blue veins beneath the skin, It was a sign of noble breeding and ultimate beauty. To achieve this ghostly appearance, they would apply a mixture that contained not just lead, but mercury as well. Mercury, the same substance that we now know causes severe neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. But medieval women would rub it into their skin daily, watching with satisfaction as their complexion grew paler and more ethereal. They had no idea they were slowly poisoning themselves with every application. The preparation of these beauty concoctions was an art form in itself. Women would spend hours grinding minerals and mixing potions in their chambers. Arsenic was another popular ingredient, prized for its ability to create that coveted deathly pallor. They would mix it with vinegar and rose water, creating a paste that they believed was as precious as liquid gold. But the face was just the beginning. Medieval beauty standards demanded that women have a high, broad forehead. The higher the hairline, the more intelligent and refined you were considered to be. So what did they do? They plucked out their hair. Not just their eyebrows, mind you, but their entire hairline, sometimes going back several inches. This wasn't a quick process. It was hours upon hours of painstaking plucking, often done with crude metal tweezers that would leave the scalp raw and bleeding. Some women, desperate to speed up the process, would apply acids to their hairlines to burn the hair away. The result was often severe scarring and infections that could prove fatal. And speaking of hair, let's talk about what they did to achieve the perfect golden locks that were so prized during this era. Natural blonde hair was rare, so most women had to create it artificially. They would spend entire days sitting in the sun with their hair soaked in a mixture of urine, sulfur, and other chemicals. Yes, you heard that right. Urine was considered an essential ingredient in medieval hair bleaching. The process was called bleaching with aqua vitae, and it was as revolting as it sounds. Women would collect urine, sometimes their own, sometimes from young children because it was considered purer, and mix it with crushed saffron, turmeric, and sulfur. They would then coat their hair with this mixture and sit in the blazing sun for hours, wearing special hats with no tops so their hair could be exposed while their faces remained shaded. The smell was apparently so overwhelming that servants would have to burn incense constantly to mask the odor. And the damage to the hair was catastrophic. Many women ended up completely bald from these treatments, their hair literally dissolving from the chemical burns. But here's where it gets even stranger. When women did lose their hair from these treatments, they didn't simply give up on their beauty routines. Instead, they would purchase wigs made from the hair of corpses. That's right, hair harvested from dead bodies was a thriving business in medieval times. Professional hair collectors would visit morgues and battlefields, carefully removing hair from the deceased to sell to wig makers. The most prized hair came from young women who had died of natural causes, but in times of high demand, any hair would do. These wigs were incredibly expensive and were often passed down through generations like family heirlooms. The irony, of course, was that many of these women were dying young themselves from their beauty routines, contributing to the very supply chain they depended on for their wigs. Now, let's talk about teeth. You might assume that white, straight teeth were prized in medieval times, but you'd be completely wrong. In fact, having rotten, blackened teeth was actually considered a sign of wealth and status. Why? Because sugar was so expensive that only the very rich could afford it. And sugar, as we know, rots teeth. So wealthy women would actually blacken their teeth artificially to show that they could afford a sugar-rich diet. They would use a mixture of soot, charcoal, and various plant dyes to stain their teeth black. Some would even have their teeth filed down or deliberately damaged to achieve that coveted rotten look. For those who couldn't afford real sugar but wanted to fake the status symbol of bad teeth, there were professional tooth blackeners who would paint your teeth for a fee. The more rotten and decayed your smile looked, the more impressed people would be with your apparent wealth. But perhaps the most dangerous beauty practice of all was the medieval approach to body shaping. Long before corsets, medieval women were using incredibly tight lacing to achieve an impossibly small waist. These weren't the relatively safe corsets of later centuries. These were crude contraptions made of wood, metal, and leather that would be tightened to the point where women could barely breathe. The goal was to achieve a waist so small that it defied human anatomy. Women would have their servants tighten these contraptions every morning until they literally couldn't breathe properly. Many would faint regularly from lack of oxygen, which was actually seen as fashionable and feminine. The long-term effects were catastrophic. These tight lacings would deform the ribcage, crush internal organs, and cause permanent damage to the spine. Many women developed what we would now recognize as serious eating disorders, deliberately starving themselves to fit into these impossible contraptions. And then there was bloodletting. Medieval physicians believed that removing blood from the body would improve the complexion and overall health. Women would regularly have leeches applied to their faces and bodies, or have their veins opened with primitive cutting tools. The idea was that draining the bad blood would leave them with a pure, glowing complexion. These bloodletting sessions often took place in unsanitary conditions, with the same tools being used on multiple people without any cleaning. Infections were rampant, and many women died from blood loss or sepsis. But the practice continued because the temporary pallor that followed blood loss was considered beautiful. Even more bizarre was the practice of deliberately infecting oneself with parasites. Some medieval beauty manuals recommended swallowing tapeworm eggs to achieve rapid weight loss. The theory was that the parasites would consume the food you ate, keeping you thin without having to starve yourself. Of course, what actually happened was that these women would become severely malnourished as the parasites drained their bodies of nutrients. Many developed severe intestinal problems, and the parasites would often grow to enormous sizes, sometimes visible moving under the skin. The most tragic part of all these medieval beauty practices was how young they started. Girls as young as 7 or 8 would begin these routines, their parents believing they were giving their daughters the best possible start in life. These children would grow up never knowing what it felt like to have healthy skin, strong teeth, or normal breathing patterns. What's perhaps most shocking is that many of these practices continued well into the Renaissance and beyond, even as medical knowledge began to advance. The pursuit of beauty was so ingrained in medieval culture that women were willing to risk everything, including their lives, to achieve the impossible standards of their time. These weren't women who were ignorant or foolish. Many were highly educated and intelligent, but they lived in a world where a woman's value was determined almost entirely by her appearance, where beauty could mean the difference between a life of privilege and a life of poverty. In that context, risking death for beauty didn't seem like vanity. It seemed like survival. As we look back on these practices from our modern perspective, it's easy to feel superior, to shake our heads at the foolishness of our ancestors. But before we judge too harshly, we might want to consider our own beauty practices, our own willingness to inject toxins into our faces, to undergo dangerous surgeries, to pursue standards of beauty that may seem just as bizarre to future generations looking back at us. The more things change, it seems, the more they stay the same. Based on the reference materials and your request to continue from the previous script content, here's part 3 of the 12-part series, Why Beauty Routines Were Strange in Medieval Times. Medieval beauty wasn't just about looking good. It was about survival in a world where your appearance could literally determine whether you lived or died. And nothing demonstrated this more clearly than the bizarre and often deadly beauty standards surrounding hair and teeth. Let's start with hair, because what medieval people did to achieve the perfect hairstyle would make even the most extreme beauty influencer today run screaming. The ideal medieval woman was expected to have a high, prominent forehead. But here's the thing. Most people weren't naturally blessed with this look. So what did they do? They plucked out their hairline, row by row, hair by hair. Imagine sitting for hours while someone methodically pulled out every single hair from your forehead and temples, often extending inches back from your natural hairline. The pain was excruciating, but that was just the beginning. Many women used a mixture of sulfur and pitch, basically tar, to permanently burn away unwanted hair. The chemical burns left permanent scarring, but hey, at least you had that coveted high forehead. But the real horror show was what they did to achieve the perfect hair color. Blonde hair was considered the pinnacle of beauty, associated with purity and nobility. If you weren't naturally blonde, well, you had options. Terrible, terrible options. The most common hair bleaching method involved soaking your hair in human urine. Not just any urine. Specifically, the urine of young children was considered most effective. Women would collect it in special containers and apply it to their hair regularly. The ammonia in the urine would gradually lighten dark hair, but the smell was absolutely nauseating. Imagine walking around smelling like a public bathroom, all for the sake of beauty. When urine wasn't doing the trick fast enough, they escalated to more dangerous chemicals. A popular recipe called for mixing sulfur, lead, honey, and various herbs into a paste that would be slathered onto the hair and left for hours. The sulfur would burn the scalp, the lead would slowly poison the system, but the hair would lighten. Many women lost patches of hair entirely, leaving them with bald spots and chemical burns. For those who could afford it, there was always the option of wigs. But medieval wigs weren't made from synthetic fibers or even donated hair from willing participants. No, the most prized wigs were made from the hair of corpses. Professional hair collectors would visit morgues and battlefields, cutting hair from the dead to sell to wig makers. The fresher the corpse, the better the hair quality. These death wigs were incredibly expensive and were often passed down through families like precious heirlooms. Women would wear the hair of long-dead strangers on their heads, completely unaware of what diseases or parasites might be lurking in those ancient locks. Now, if you think the hair situation was bad, wait until you hear about medieval dental beauty standards. This is where things get truly twisted, because in medieval Europe, having rotten, blackened teeth was actually considered attractive. Yes, you heard that right. Bad teeth were a status symbol. Here's the logic. Sugar was incredibly expensive, imported from distant lands at enormous cost. Only the wealthy could afford to regularly consume sweets, and sugar, as we know, rots your teeth. So if you had black, decaying teeth, it meant you were rich enough to afford sugar. Poor people who couldn't afford sugar had relatively healthy white teeth, which was seen as a mark of poverty. This led to one of the most bizarre beauty trends in human history. People would deliberately blacken their healthy teeth to appear wealthy. They used a mixture of charcoal, soot, and sometimes even crushed insects to create a black paste that they would rub onto their teeth. Some recipes called for mixing in vinegar or wine, which would actually help the blackening agent stick better while simultaneously eating away at the tooth enamel. The truly dedicated would go even further, using acids to deliberately create cavities and decay. They believed that genuine rot looked more authentic than artificial blackening. Women would hold vinegar or wine in their mouths for extended periods, or chew on acidic fruits until their teeth began to genuinely decay. Queen Elizabeth, the first of England, was famous for her blackened teeth, which she achieved through a combination of sugar consumption and deliberate blackening. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed accounts of her rotting smile, which she displayed proudly as a sign of her wealth and status. But perhaps the most disturbing dental practice was tooth filing. Some regions developed the belief that pointed, sharp teeth were attractive, resembling the fangs of predators. People would use rough files and stones to grind their teeth into points, often filing away so much enamel that the nerves were exposed. The pain was constant and excruciating, but the look was considered fierce and attractive. The wealthy sometimes went in the opposite direction, having their teeth extracted and replaced with teeth pulled from corpses or even living poor people. Tooth transplants were a thriving business, with dentists maintaining supplies of fresh teeth pulled from the mouths of the desperate poor who sold them for money. These transplanted teeth rarely took hold properly and often led to infections and abscesses. But for a brief period, the wealthy could sport a full set of teeth, even if they belonged to someone else entirely. The irony of all these practices was that they were often self-defeating. Women who bleached their hair with urine and chemicals often ended up bald. People who blackened their teeth often developed real decay and lost their teeth entirely. Those who plucked their hairlines sometimes developed permanent bald patches and scarring. But the social pressure was so intense that people continued these practices generation after generation. Beauty was literally a matter of life and death in medieval society. An unattractive woman might never marry, condemning her to poverty and social exile. An unattractive man might find doors closed to him in business and politics. The pursuit of beauty became an arms race of self-destruction, with each generation finding new and more extreme ways to torture their bodies in service of impossible standards. They would poison themselves with lead, burn themselves with acid, and mutilate their teeth and hair, all in the desperate hope of achieving a beauty ideal that was itself based on disease and decay. What's perhaps most chilling is how normalized this suffering became. Medieval beauty manuals discuss these procedures with the same casual tone we might use to describe applying moisturizer. The pain was simply accepted as the price of beauty, and women were expected to endure it without complaint. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine living in constant pain from chemical burns on your scalp, infection from extracted teeth, and the ongoing effects of lead and mercury poisoning, all while being told this was normal and necessary for a woman of quality. These beauty standards didn't just harm individuals, they shaped entire societies. The resources devoted to these practices, the time spent on painful procedures, the medical complications that resulted, all of this represented a massive drain on medieval communities. Talented, intelligent women were reduced to spending their lives in pursuit of beauty ideals that actively damaged their health and cognitive abilities. Yet people persisted because the alternative, social rejection and economic ruin, seemed even worse. In a world where a woman's value was determined almost entirely by her appearance and ability to marry well, there seemed to be no choice but to submit to these brutal beauty regimens. The medieval obsession with extreme beauty standards reveals something dark about human nature, our willingness to inflict suffering on ourselves and others in pursuit of social acceptance. These weren't just individual choices, they were the result of social systems that valued appearance over health, conformity over individuality, and suffering over common sense. As we'll see in our next exploration of medieval beauty practices, things somehow managed to get even stranger and more dangerous when we examine what people did to their bodies in the name of fashion and attractiveness. Now I'll write part 4 of the 12-part script about strange medieval beauty routines, continuing from where the previous parts left off. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval beauty culture wasn't what people put on their bodies, but what they willingly endured to achieve the perfect silhouette. The pursuit of an impossibly tiny waist through tight lacing reached levels of extremity that would make modern shapewear seem like comfortable loungewear. Women would begin this torturous process as young girls, sometimes as early as age 10, gradually training their bodies into submission with increasingly restrictive corsets. These weren't the romanticized corsets you might see in period dramas. Medieval tight lacing involved contraptions made of whalebone, steel, and leather that could compress a woman's waist to measurements that defied human anatomy. The goal was to achieve what was called a wasp waist, a measurement so small that a man could supposedly span it with his hands. To reach this ideal, women would tighten their corsets incrementally over months and years, literally reshaping their rib cages and internal organs. The process was methodical and merciless. Each morning, servants would pull the laces tighter, often using mechanical devices for extra leverage. Women would hold on to bedposts or specially designed tightening frames, while multiple attendants yanked the cords with all their strength. The goal was to reduce the waist by several inches from its natural size, sometimes achieving measurements as small as 13 or 14 inches on a fully grown woman. The physical consequences were catastrophic. The extreme compression displaced internal organs, pushing the liver, stomach, and intestines into unnatural positions. Women's ribs would actually break and heal in curved positions to accommodate the constant pressure. Breathing became labored and shallow as the lungs had no room to expand properly. Many women fainted regularly from lack of oxygen, which was actually considered a desirable sign of proper tight lacing. Digestion became nearly impossible. The stomach, compressed to a fraction of its normal size, could only hold tiny amounts of food. Women had to eat minuscule portions throughout the day, often consuming only liquids during periods of extreme tight lacing. The pressure on the digestive system led to chronic constipation, acid reflux, and malnutrition, even among the wealthy who had access to abundant food. The reproductive system suffered tremendously. The displacement of internal organs affected the uterus and ovaries, leading to irregular menstruation, fertility problems, and dangerous complications during pregnancy and childbirth. Many women died in labor due to pelvic deformities caused by years of tight lacing. Those who survived often passed the practice down to their daughters, seeing the health problems as a necessary sacrifice for beauty and social status. But the physical damage was only part of the story. The psychological impact of extreme tight lacing created a culture of competition and suffering among women. They would compare waist measurements obsessively, viewing each reduction as a victory and any loosening as a moral failure. Women developed elaborate rituals around their corsets, seeing them as both instruments of torture and symbols of feminine achievement. The most extreme practitioners would never fully remove their corsets, even sleeping in specially designed nighttime versions. Their bodies became so dependent on the artificial support that removing the corset entirely could cause fainting or collapse. Some women reported feeling naked or formless without their corsets, as their natural body shape had become completely foreign to them. Medical professionals of the time, almost exclusively male, were divided on the practice. Some warned of the health dangers, documenting cases of organ displacement, broken ribs, and respiratory failure. Others actually promoted tight lacing, claiming it created a more refined and civilized female form. The medical establishment's mixed messages only added to the confusion and suffering of women trying to navigate these beauty standards. The tools used for extreme tight lacing were as varied as they were brutal. Some corsets featured metal clasps that could be locked, preventing the wearer from loosening them throughout the day. Others incorporated pulleys and mechanical tightening devices that could achieve compression impossible with human strength alone. The wealthiest women commissioned custom corsets with internal steel frameworks that gradually trained their bodies into specific shapes. Young girls beginning the tight lacing process underwent what was essentially a form of sanctioned torture. Their mothers and governesses would supervise daily tightening sessions, treating the girls' cries of pain as necessary steps toward womanhood. The process was seen as character building, teaching girls to endure suffering for the sake of beauty and social acceptance. The social pressure to maintain extreme waist measurements was relentless. Women who loosened their corsets or failed to achieve sufficiently small measurements faced ridicule and social ostracism. At social gatherings, waist measurements were discussed openly. with the smallest measurements receiving praise and admiration. This created a competitive atmosphere where women felt compelled to endanger their health for social standing. The economic impact of tight lacing was substantial. Wealthy families spent fortunes on custom corsets, hiring specialists to design and fit these instruments of compression. The corset-making industry employed thousands of craftsmen who developed increasingly sophisticated methods of achieving smaller and smaller waist measurements. The demand for extreme tight lacing drove innovation in materials and construction techniques, all in service of an impossible beauty ideal. But perhaps most shocking of all was how this practice was normalized and even celebrated. Fashion plates and beauty guides promoted tight lacing as the height of feminine refinement. Popular literature romanticized the tiny-waisted heroine, creating cultural narratives that equated extreme body modification with virtue and desirability. The suffering involved was not only accepted, but actively encouraged as proof of a woman's dedication to feminine ideals. The international nature of this beauty trend meant that women across different cultures and continents were simultaneously destroying their bodies in pursuit of the same impossible standard. From European courts to colonial settlements, the practice spread wherever Western beauty ideals took hold, creating a global phenomenon of sanctioned self-harm in the name of attractiveness. Even when women wanted to escape the practice, the physical and social consequences made it nearly impossible. Bodies that had been shaped by years of tight lacing couldn't function normally without artificial support. The muscle atrophy and organ displacement meant that removing corsets could cause immediate health crises. Socially, women who abandoned tight lacing faced judgment and exclusion from their communities. The most tragic aspect of medieval tight lacing was how it robbed women of their agency over their own bodies. What began as a beauty practice became a form of systematic oppression, creating generations of women whose lives were defined by physical suffering and limitation. The pursuit of an impossibly small waist became a metaphor for the broader constraints placed on women's lives, bodies, and choices. These extreme beauty practices reveal the dark underbelly of medieval society's obsession with appearance. While we might view these historical practices with horror, they remind us that the pressure to conform to impossible beauty standards has deep historical roots. The willingness to endure extreme physical modification for social acceptance shows how powerful these cultural forces can be, and how they can lead entire societies to normalize practices that seem unthinkably cruel to later generations. As we continue to explore the strange and dangerous world of medieval beauty, we'll discover that the pursuit of physical perfection led people to even more extreme measures, including practices that deliberately courted disease and death in the name of attractiveness. Looking at the provided references and your script summary, here's part 5 of your medieval beauty routine script. 1,800 to 1,900 words. Even as the devastating plague swept through medieval Scotland and the cultural divides between highlands and lowlands deepened, another form of suffering plagued the lives of women across all social classes. The pursuit of beauty in medieval times demanded not just the toxic substances we've already explored, but also extreme physical modifications that would reshape the very structure of the human body. These practices, born from rigid beauty standards and social expectations, created a culture where pain was not just accepted, but celebrated as the price of feminine virtue. The most widespread and perhaps most damaging of these practices was the art of tight lacing, a method of body modification that would define feminine beauty for centuries. Unlike the relatively simple corsets of later periods, medieval tight lacing involved a complex system of leather, whalebone, and metal that was designed to compress the torso into an unnatural hourglass shape. Women would begin this process as young as 12, when their bodies were still developing. ensuring that their rib cages would grow around the constraints rather than naturally expanding. The process began each morning before dawn, when a young woman would be strapped into her corset by her mother or servant. The lacing was pulled progressively tighter over weeks and months, gradually reducing the waist circumference by as much as 6 to 8 inches. The pressure was so intense that many women fainted regularly, leading to the romanticized notion of feminine delicacy that pervaded medieval literature. But this delicacy was manufactured through systematic organ compression that forced the liver, stomach, and intestines into unnatural positions. Margaret of Wessex, a noblewoman whose diary survived from the 13th century, wrote extensively about her daily struggles with tight lacing. She described how eating more than a few spoonfuls of food would cause excruciating pain, as her compressed stomach had no room to expand. She documented fainting spells that occurred multiple times daily and chronic back pain that left her bedridden for weeks at a time. Most disturbing were her accounts of the breathing difficulties that plagued her constantly, as her compressed ribcage prevented her lungs from fully expanding. But Margaret's suffering was considered a mark of virtue and dedication to feminine ideals. Her husband praised her for her discipline and devotion to beauty, and other noblewomen envied her impossibly narrow waist. The smaller the waist, the more virtuous and desirable the woman was considered. Some women achieved waist measurements of just 14 or 15 inches, measurements that required such extreme compression that they could barely move without assistance. The health consequences of tight lacing were catastrophic and lifelong. The constant pressure on internal organs caused digestive problems that left many women chronically malnourished, despite having access to food. The compressed liver couldn't function properly, leading to jaundice and toxin buildup throughout the body. The repositioned intestines caused chronic constipation and intestinal blockages that were often fatal. Many women developed what we would now recognize as eating disorders, as consuming any significant amount of food became physically impossible and intensely painful. Perhaps most tragically, tight lacing made childbirth exponentially more dangerous. The compressed pelvis and displaced organs created complications that frequently resulted in death for both mother and child. Birth records from medieval England show that women who practiced extreme tight lacing had maternal mortality rates nearly double that of peasant women who couldn't afford such modifications. Yet this risk was considered acceptable, even noble, as the pursuit of beauty was deemed more important than survival. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Women became dependent on their corsets, not just for their appearance, but for basic physical support. The compressed ribcage and weakened core muscles meant that removing the corset, even temporarily, caused severe pain and difficulty breathing. Many women reported feeling unable to recognize their own bodies without the artificial shape imposed by their constraints. This created a form of body dysmorphia that was encouraged and celebrated by medieval society. Beyond tight lacing, medieval women subjected themselves to equally extreme modifications in pursuit of beauty ideals. Hair removal practices went far beyond simple plucking to include methods that were designed to permanently prevent hair growth. Women would apply caustic mixtures containing lye, quicklime, and other corrosive substances to their foreheads to create the fashionable high hairline that was prized among the nobility. This process burned away not just hair, but often layers of skin, leaving permanent scarring and disfigurement. The mixture, known as depilatory paste, would be applied to the forehead and left for hours, while the woman endured excruciating burning sensations. The goal was to kill the hair follicles permanently, but the process often went too deep, destroying skin tissue and nerve endings. Many women were left with permanent numbness across their foreheads, while others developed chronic infections from the chemical burns that could prove fatal. Eyebrow removal was equally brutal. Rather than simply plucking individual hairs, Women would use heated metal tools to burn away entire sections of their brows. The process was performed using small branding irons heated over open flames until they glowed red hot. These would then be carefully applied to the brow area to sear away unwanted hair. The smell of burning hair and flesh was considered a normal part of a woman's beauty routine, and the resulting burns and scars were hidden beneath thick applications of lead-based cosmetics. The pursuit of pale, translucent skin drove women to even more extreme measures. Beyond the lead and mercury applications we've discussed, some women practiced controlled bloodletting, specifically for cosmetic purposes. They believed that regularly draining blood would maintain the pale, ethereal complexion that was fashionable among the upper classes. This practice involved making small incisions in the arms or temples and allowing blood to flow into specially designed bowls. The bloodletting was performed monthly, sometimes more frequently, and was often combined with the application of leeches to create a more dramatic draining effect. Women would lose significant amounts of blood during these sessions, leaving them weak, anemic, and susceptible to infection. Many developed chronic fatigue and other symptoms of severe anemia, but these were seen as signs of refined delicacy rather than dangerous illness. Some women took the pursuit of paleness even further by deliberately inducing mild illnesses that would create the one, fragile appearance that was considered beautiful. They would intentionally expose themselves to certain diseases or consume substances that would make them mildly sick, believing that the resulting pallor and weight loss enhanced their attractiveness. This practice of deliberate illness was particularly common among young women preparing for marriage, as a frail, ethereal appearance was thought to appeal to potential husbands. The pressure to conform to these beauty standards began in early childhood. Girls as young as 8 or 9 were introduced to mild versions of these practices, gradually increasing in intensity as they matured. By the time they reached marriageable age, many had already suffered permanent damage from years of toxic exposure, physical modification, and deliberate self-harm. Yet this was considered normal and necessary preparation for a woman's role in society. The social pressure to maintain these practices was enormous. Women who refused to participate in extreme beauty modifications were considered lazy, vain, or rebellious. They faced social ostracism and significantly reduced marriage prospects. In a society where a woman's survival depended largely on making a good marriage, the pressure to conform to beauty standards was literally a matter of life and death. Even women who recognized the dangers of these practices often felt they had no choice but to continue. The beauty standards were so deeply embedded in medieval culture that deviation from them was seen as a moral failing rather than a health-conscious decision. Women who attempted to moderate their beauty routines were often forced back into extreme practices by family members, potential suitors, or social pressure. The most tragic aspect of these medieval beauty practices was how they were justified and celebrated. The pain and suffering were reframed as virtue, discipline, and devotion. Women who endured the most extreme modifications were held up as examples of ideal femininity. Their willingness to sacrifice their health and comfort for beauty was seen as proof of their moral character and dedication to their families and society. This created a cycle where each generation of women passed these dangerous practices down to their daughters, believing they were teaching them essential life skills. Mothers who had suffered through decades of toxic cosmetics, extreme body modification, and deliberate illness genuinely believed they were preparing their daughters for successful, virtuous lives. The idea that beauty could be achieved without suffering was virtually unthinkable in medieval society. The long-term consequences of these practices extended far beyond individual suffering. The widespread use of toxic substances and extreme body modifications contributed to high rates of infertility, birth defects, and maternal mortality that affected entire communities. The economic cost was also significant. as families spent enormous amounts of money on cosmetics, treatments, and medical care for beauty-related health problems. Yet perhaps most importantly, these practices reflect the broader medieval worldview that women's bodies existed primarily for the pleasure and approval of others. The willingness to endure extreme pain and permanent damage in pursuit of beauty standards created by men reveals the profound powerlessness of women in medieval society. Their bodies were not their own, but rather projects to be modified and perfected according to external expectations. Understanding these historical beauty practices helps us recognize how beauty standards have always been used as tools of social control. The medieval woman's willingness to poison herself with lead, compress her organs with tight lacing, and burn away her hair with chemicals was not fundamentally different from modern practices that encourage women to risk their health for appearance. The specific methods may have changed, but the underlying message that women's worth depends on their willingness to suffer for beauty remains disturbingly consistent across centuries. As we continue to explore the strange and often dangerous world of medieval beauty, we'll see how these individual practices combine to create a culture where women's suffering was not just normalized, but celebrated as the highest form of feminine virtue. Based on the reference materials provided, here's part 6 of the script for why beauty routines were strange in medieval times. But perhaps the most shocking beauty practice of medieval times involved the deliberate poisoning of one's own body in pursuit of an impossibly pale complexion. For medieval women, a sun-kissed tan was not a sign of health and vitality as we might consider it today, but rather a mark of peasant labor, of working outdoors in the fields like common folk. True nobility was measured by skin so pale it appeared almost translucent, with delicate blue veins visible beneath the surface like a living work of art. To achieve this coveted ghostly pallor, women turned to a deadly arsenal of cosmetic concoctions that would horrify any modern dermatologist. The most popular foundation of the era was a mixture of white lead and vinegar, creating a paint-like substance called ceruse that could be applied in thick layers across the face, neck, and exposed décolletage. This lead-based makeup promised an instant transformation, covering blemishes and creating that desired porcelain doll appearance that signaled wealth and refinement. What these women didn't understand was that they were essentially painting their faces with poison. Lead, as we now know, is a potent neurotoxin that accumulates in the body over time. With each application, these beauty-conscious ladies were slowly but surely destroying their nervous systems, their organs, and their minds. The symptoms began subtly enough, perhaps a slight tremor in the hands or an unusual fatigue that seemed to linger despite adequate rest. But the lead poisoning didn't stop there. As the toxic metal built up in their systems, women experienced increasingly severe symptoms. Their gums would begin to recede and blacken, creating what was grimly known as the lead line, a dark discoloration along the gum line that served as a telltale sign of chronic lead exposure. Their hair would fall out in clumps, leaving behind patchy, thinning scalps that required elaborate wigs and headdresses to conceal. The neurological effects were perhaps the most disturbing. Women who had spent years applying lead-based cosmetics often developed what physicians of the time called painter's colic, severe abdominal pain accompanied by confusion, memory loss, and erratic behavior. Some became so mentally impaired that they could no longer recognize their own family members, wandering through their homes like ghosts of their former selves. Yet even as these horrifying symptoms became apparent, the practice continued unabated. The social pressure to maintain that deadly pale complexion was so intense that many women chose to risk their health rather than appear common or working class. They would rather slowly poison themselves than face the social stigma of natural, healthy-looking skin. But lead wasn't the only toxic ingredient in the medieval beauty arsenal. Mercury, another highly poisonous heavy metal, was commonly used in various cosmetic preparations. Women applied mercury-based creams to remove freckles and age spots, not realizing they were causing irreversible damage to their kidneys, liver, and brain. The mercury would cause their teeth to loosen and fall out, their gums to swell and bleed, and their breath to take on a metallic, putrid odor that no amount of herbs or perfumes could mask. Arsenic too found its way into medieval beauty routines. This notorious poison was mixed into face powders and skin lightening treatments, promising to give women that coveted pale glow. The irony was cruel. While arsenic could indeed create a temporary luminosity to the skin, it was simultaneously destroying the body from within, causing organ failure, nerve damage, and eventually death. The most tragic aspect of these poisonous beauty practices was that they often targeted the youngest and most vulnerable members of society. Young girls, some barely into their teens, would begin using these toxic cosmetics as soon as they reached marriageable age. Their developing bodies were even more susceptible to the devastating effects of heavy metal poisoning, meaning that many never lived to see their 20th birthday. Consider the case of Lady Catherine Montague, a fictional but representative example of the countless women who fell victim to these deadly beauty standards. At age 14, Catherine began her daily ritual of applying ceruse to achieve the pale complexion expected of a nobleman's daughter. By 18, she was experiencing severe headaches and memory problems. By 22, her hair had fallen out completely, her teeth were loose and blackened, and she suffered from violent seizures that left her bedridden for days. Despite the obvious connection between her cosmetic routine and her declining health, Catherine continued to apply the lead-based makeup until her death at age 25. Her final portrait, painted just months before her passing, shows a ghostly pale woman with hollow eyes and sunken cheeks, the very image of the beauty ideal she had sacrificed her life to achieve. The use of these toxic substances wasn't limited to facial cosmetics. Women also applied lead and mercury-based preparations to their hair, hoping to achieve the golden blonde locks that were fashionable among the upper classes. They would soak their hair in solutions containing these deadly metals, then sit in the sun for hours to activate the lightening process. The result was often severe chemical burns to the scalp, permanent hair loss, and systemic poisoning as the toxins were absorbed through the damaged skin. Even more disturbing was the practice of using these substances around the delicate eye area. Women would line their eyes with coal containing lead and antimony, a toxic metalloid that could cause severe eye irritation, vision problems, and even blindness. They believed that darkly lined eyes made them appear more mysterious and alluring, but the price they paid was often their sight itself. The preparation of these toxic cosmetics was an elaborate and dangerous process in itself. Women would spend hours grinding lead ore or mercury into fine powders, mixing them with various oils and vinegars to create the perfect consistency. The very act of preparing these substances exposed them to dangerous levels of toxic dust and fumes, ensuring that even the most careful application would result in poisoning. What makes these practices even more horrifying is that they were often passed down from mother to daughter as cherished family secrets. Young girls would learn these deadly beauty routines from their mothers and grandmothers, who had no idea they were passing on techniques that would slowly kill their beloved daughters. The knowledge was shared with love and care, making the tragic outcome all the more heartbreaking. The medieval obsession with toxic beauty reached its peak during the Renaissance, when the use of lead-based cosmetics became so widespread that entire noble families would suffer from chronic lead poisoning. Court physicians began to notice patterns of illness among the aristocracy, but the connection to cosmetics was often overlooked or ignored in favor of other explanations like bad air or divine punishment. This deadly pursuit of beauty reveals something profound about medieval society's relationship with physical appearance. the pressure to conform to beauty standards was so intense that women were willing to literally poison themselves rather than appear ordinary. It speaks to a culture that valued aesthetic perfection over health, youth, and even life itself, a tragic testament to the power of social expectations and the lengths to which people will go to meet them. Why beauty routines were strange in medieval times, Part 7. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that the very products meant to enhance your beauty could slowly poison you to death. This was the grim reality for countless medieval women who pursued beauty standards that were not just demanding, but genuinely life-threatening. We've explored how medieval beauty practices involved toxic cosmetics, dangerous body modifications, and social pressures that literally killed those who followed them. But perhaps no aspect of medieval beauty culture was more disturbing than the systematic normalization of self-harm in the name of attractiveness. The most chilling aspect of medieval beauty routines wasn't just their danger, but how completely ordinary they seemed to those who practiced them. These weren't secret rituals performed by a desperate few. They were mainstream beauty practices, taught from mother to daughter, recommended by physicians, and celebrated by society's elite. The very foundations of medieval beauty culture were built on a collective acceptance that suffering was not just acceptable, but necessary for true beauty. Consider the medieval concept of bella donna, which literally means beautiful woman in Italian. This term became synonymous with a plant extract that women would drop into their eyes to dilate their pupils, creating what was considered an alluring, dreamy appearance. The plant's scientific name is Atropa belladonna, and it's one of the most toxic plants in the Western Hemisphere. Women would regularly blind themselves temporarily with a deadly neurotoxin because large, dark pupils were considered sexually attractive. The practice was so common that the plant became permanently associated with feminine beauty, despite causing countless cases of permanent blindness, brain damage, and death. What made this practice particularly insidious was how it was marketed and understood. Medieval beauty treatises didn't present belladonna as a dangerous gamble with death. Instead, they framed it as a sophisticated beauty technique used by refined ladies of the court. Young women were taught that enduring the burning sensation, temporary blindness, and disorientation was simply the price of elegance. The pain wasn't seen as a warning sign, but as proof that the treatment was working. The normalization extended far beyond individual products to encompass entire beauty philosophies that celebrated suffering. Medieval literature is filled with descriptions of beautiful women who were praised specifically for their willingness to endure pain for beauty. The ideal medieval woman was often described as having skin so pale it appeared translucent, achieved through bloodletting and toxic whitening agents. She was supposed to be so delicately built that she seemed fragile, accomplished through tight lacing that compressed her organs. Her hair was to be perfectly styled, even if it meant using caustic chemicals that burned her scalp. This wasn't accidental. Medieval society deliberately cultivated beauty standards that required women to harm themselves because suffering was seen as proof of virtue. The logic was deeply intertwined with religious teachings about mortification of the flesh and the sinfulness of the physical body. A woman who was willing to endure pain for beauty was demonstrating proper feminine submission and spiritual discipline. Those who refused were often viewed as vain, lazy, or morally deficient. The social pressure to conform was immense and multifaceted. It wasn't just about attracting a husband, though that was certainly part of it. Beauty routines served as markers of social class, religious devotion, and moral character. A woman's appearance communicated her family's wealth, her own virtue, and her understanding of proper social hierarchies. Failing to maintain appropriate beauty standards could result in social ostracism, difficulty finding marriage prospects, and even accusations of witchcraft or moral corruption. Perhaps most tragically, the very systems meant to protect women often reinforced these dangerous practices. Medical authorities of the time actively promoted toxic beauty treatments, lending scientific credibility to practices that were slowly killing their patients. Church leaders, while occasionally condemning vanity in general terms, more often reinforced the idea that women's suffering was spiritually beneficial. Legal systems offered no protection against dangerous cosmetics because the concept of product safety simply didn't exist. The economic structures of medieval society also ensured that dangerous beauty practices would continue. Entire industries developed around producing and selling toxic cosmetics. Merchants made fortunes importing deadly ingredients like mercury and lead. Artisans specialized in creating elaborate torture devices disguised as beauty tools. The economic incentives all pointed toward continuing and expanding these practices, not questioning their safety. Even when people began to notice the health consequences, the response wasn't to abandon dangerous practices, but to develop new justifications for them. When women started dying from lead poisoning, the deaths were attributed to their moral failings or divine punishment rather than their cosmetics. When mercury treatments caused neurological damage, the symptoms were blamed on female hysteria or demonic possession. The beauty industry adapted and evolved, but rarely in ways that prioritized women's actual well-being. The peer pressure among women themselves became a powerful force for perpetuating these practices. Women who had already sacrificed their health for beauty had strong psychological incentives to believe their suffering had been worthwhile. They became advocates for the very practices that had harmed them, teaching younger women that enduring pain was a necessary rite of passage into true femininity. This created cycles of abuse that could persist for generations within families and social circles. The documentation we have from medieval sources reveals how thoroughly these attitudes had penetrated every level of society. Personal letters between noblewomen casually discuss beauty treatments that we now know were slowly killing them. Account books from wealthy households list purchases of toxic cosmetics alongside food and clothing as routine necessities. Medical texts describe horrific symptoms of poisoning while recommending continued use of the substances causing them. What's particularly disturbing is how sophisticated the rationalization systems became. Medieval beauty culture developed elaborate theories about why suffering was beneficial that went far beyond simple religious explanations. They created pseudo-scientific justifications about how pain purified the blood, how toxic substances could balance bodily humors, and how the soul was strengthened through physical trials. These weren't crude superstitions, but carefully constructed belief systems that could satisfy educated, intelligent people. The international nature of medieval trade networks meant that dangerous beauty practices could spread rapidly across vast distances. A toxic cosmetic developed in one region could quickly become fashionable across an entire continent. Women in England were poisoning themselves with mercury imported from Spain, while French noblewomen were using lead-based cosmetics manufactured in Italy. The globalization of beauty standards meant the globalization of beauty-related harm. Children were particularly vulnerable to this normalized violence. Young girls were initiated into dangerous beauty practices before they were old enough to understand the risks or consent to them. Mothers would begin applying toxic cosmetics to their daughters' skin while they were still small children, ensuring that the damage would accumulate over their entire lifetimes. The earlier the practices began, the more severe the eventual health consequences would be. The seasonal and cyclical nature of many medieval beauty routines meant that women faced repeated exposure to dangerous substances throughout their lives. Spring bloodletting sessions, summer skin bleaching treatments, autumn hair dyeing rituals, and winter skin softening regimens ensured that there was never a time when women's bodies could recover from the toxic assault. Each cycle added to the cumulative damage, creating a slow but inexorable march towards serious health problems. Religious festivals and social celebrations often became opportunities for particularly intense beauty preparation, with women undergoing especially dangerous treatments to look their best for important events. Wedding preparations might involve weeks of intensive toxic treatments. Court appearances required extreme measures to achieve the pale, ethereal look that signified high status. These special occasions created spikes of particularly severe exposure that could cause acute poisoning episodes. The geographical isolation of many medieval communities meant that once dangerous practices took hold, they could persist for centuries without outside intervention. Rural areas might develop their own local variations of toxic beauty treatments, passed down through generations of women who had no access to information about their dangers. These isolated communities could preserve particularly lethal beauty traditions long after they had been abandoned in more connected areas. The complete absence of consumer protection or product regulation meant that even well-intentioned beauty products could be contaminated with dangerous substances. Lead might be added to cosmetics, not for its cosmetic properties, but because it was a cheap adulterant. Mercury could find its way into beauty products through contaminated ingredients or careless manufacturing processes. Women had no way to know what they were actually putting on their bodies. Perhaps most tragically, the very qualities that medieval society most valued in women, such as obedience, self-sacrifice, and submission to authority, made them particularly vulnerable to these dangerous practices. Women who questioned beauty standards or refused to participate in harmful routines were seen as defying not just fashion, but fundamental social values. The same cultural forces that made women vulnerable to beauty-related harm also made it nearly impossible for them to resist or escape it. The legacy of these medieval beauty practices extended far beyond the Middle Ages themselves. Many of the toxic substances and dangerous techniques that were normalized during this period continued to be used well into the modern era. Lead-based cosmetics weren't fully banned in many countries until the 20th century. Mercury treatments persisted in some forms into the industrial age. The basic assumption that beauty required suffering remained a powerful cultural force, long after the specific practices had changed. Understanding this history helps us recognize that the medieval relationship between beauty and harm wasn't an aberration or the result of simple ignorance. It was a systematic cultural phenomenon that served specific social, economic, and political functions. The normalization of beauty-related self-harm was a feature of medieval society, not a bug. It helped maintain social hierarchies, gender roles, and economic structures that benefited those in power while extracting terrible costs from those at the bottom. This historical perspective also reveals how beauty standards and practices that seem natural or inevitable are actually the products of specific cultural and historical circumstances. The medieval period shows us that entire societies can organize themselves around beauty practices that are objectively harmful, and that these practices can persist for centuries, even when their dangers become apparent. This should make us more critical of our own beauty culture and more aware of how social pressures can normalize practices that might not actually serve our well-being. The medieval period ultimately represents one of the most extreme examples in human history of beauty culture becoming a systematic threat to women's health and survival. While we've made significant progress since then, the underlying dynamics that created this situation, including social pressure, economic incentives, and the normalization of suffering in pursuit of beauty, remain relevant today. By understanding how thoroughly medieval society convinced women to harm themselves in the name of beauty, we can better recognize and resist similar pressures in our own time. Looking at the script so far and the reference materials, I'll continue from where we left off with Part 8, focusing on the horrific beauty practices of medieval times and their consequences. Yet even as these poisonous concoctions ravaged bodies and minds, the pursuit of beauty through suffering only intensified. Medieval women, trapped within rigid social hierarchies where appearance determined destiny, willingly embraced practices that would horrify modern sensibilities. The pressure to conform to impossible ideals of beauty created a culture where pain was not just accepted, but celebrated as virtue. Consider the medieval obsession with achieving impossibly pale skin, a mark of nobility that separated the leisured elite from sun-darkened peasants. Women would apply thick layers of ceruse, a deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar, to their faces daily. This toxic paint created the coveted porcelain complexion, but at a devastating cost. The lead slowly accumulated in their bodies, causing neurological damage, kidney failure, and eventually death. Yet so powerful was the social pressure that women continued this practice generation after generation, even as they watched their mothers and sisters succumb to mysterious wasting illnesses. The pursuit of beauty extended beyond mere cosmetics into the realm of physical torture. The medieval ideal of feminine beauty demanded a wasp-like waist, achieved through the barbaric practice of tight lacing. Young girls, some as young as 10, were fitted with rigid corsets made of whalebone and steel. These instruments of torture were tightened daily, gradually compressing the ribcage and internal organs until breathing became labored and movement restricted. The pressure was so intense that many women's ribs would crack and heal incorrectly, creating permanent deformities. Internal organs shifted and compressed, leading to chronic digestive problems, breathing difficulties, and complications during childbirth that often proved fatal. The social expectation was that a proper lady's waist should measure no more than 18 inches, regardless of her natural body type. Women who failed to achieve this impossible standard faced social ostracism and reduced marriage prospects. The corset became a prison from which there was no escape, worn from dawn until dusk, creating a generation of women who could barely function without external support. Many fainted regularly from lack of oxygen, a condition so common it was considered fashionable feminine delicacy, rather than the medical emergency it truly was. But the horrors of medieval beauty culture extended even to the modification of natural features. The practice of bloodletting, ostensibly for health but often for cosmetic purposes, involved opening veins to drain blood and achieve a fashionably pale, ethereal appearance. Women would visit barber surgeons who would slice open veins in their arms or apply leeches to their faces, believing that removing blood would create the desired ghostly pallor. This practice often led to severe anemia, weakness, and increased susceptibility to disease. The medieval obsession with high foreheads created another disturbing beauty ritual. Women would pluck their hairlines, sometimes removing hair all the way back to the crown of their heads, to create the illusion of an elongated forehead. This process was incredibly painful and often led to permanent baldness and scalp infections. Some women went further, using caustic substances to burn away hair follicles, creating chemical burns that left permanent scarring. The pursuit of this particular beauty ideal was so extreme that many women rendered themselves completely bald, forced to rely on elaborate headdresses and wigs made from the hair of corpses. The use of belladonna, or deadly nightshade, represents perhaps the most shocking example of medieval beauty's deadly embrace. Women would deliberately drop this potent poison into their eyes to dilate their pupils, believing that large, dark eyes were the height of feminine allure. The name belladonna itself means beautiful woman in Italian, a testament to its widespread use despite its lethal properties. The plant contains atropine, a powerful alkaloid that causes hallucinations, delirium, and death in larger doses. Even small amounts used cosmetically caused severe eye damage, including permanent vision loss and blindness. Yet women continued this practice, choosing beauty over sight, vanity over survival. The psychological toll of these beauty practices cannot be understated. Medieval women lived in constant fear of not measuring up to impossible standards, knowing that their social status, marriage prospects, and very survival depended on their appearance. The pain they endured was not just physical, but emotional, as they sacrificed their health and well-being for fleeting moments of social acceptance. Many developed what we would now recognize as body dysmorphic disorder, obsessing over perceived flaws and subjecting themselves to increasingly extreme modifications. The beauty industry of medieval times was largely unregulated, allowing charlatans and quacks to prey upon desperate women. Cosmetic recipes were passed down through generations, often becoming more toxic with each iteration as new ingredients were added without understanding their effects. Women had no way of knowing which treatments were merely painful and which were deadly, creating a macabre lottery where the pursuit of beauty could literally be a death sentence. Perhaps most disturbing was how these practices were normalized and even celebrated. Medical texts of the time, written almost exclusively by men, often endorsed these dangerous beauty treatments as necessary for feminine virtue. The Church, while condemning vanity in principle, tacitly supported beauty practices that reinforced women's subordinate status and physical weakness. Society had created a system where women's suffering was not just tolerated, but required, where pain was proof of virtue and self-destruction was seen as self-improvement. The legacy of medieval beauty culture serves as a stark reminder of how social pressures can drive individuals to extreme self-harm in pursuit of acceptance. These practices reveal the dark intersection of gender, power, and social control, where women's bodies became battlegrounds for competing ideals of femininity, virtue, and social status. The fact that such obviously harmful practices persisted for centuries demonstrates the powerful hold that beauty standards can have over human behavior, even when the cost is health, happiness, and life itself. As we examine these historical horrors, we must remember that they were not aberrations but systematic expressions of a society that valued women's appearance over their well-being, that confused suffering with virtue, and that created impossible standards that no human could safely achieve. The medieval pursuit of beauty was not about enhancing natural features or expressing individual creativity, but about conforming to rigid ideals that demanded the sacrifice of health, comfort, and often life itself in service to social expectations that benefited no one except those who profited from women's insecurities and desperation. Looking at the medieval beauty script summary and the reference video styles, here's part 9 of the script. But while beauty rituals slowly evolved through the centuries, one practice remained stubbornly persistent across all social classes: the deliberate darkening and decay of teeth. In a world where sugar was more precious than silver, blackened teeth became the ultimate status symbol among the wealthy. Noble ladies would paint their teeth with a mixture of iron filings and vinegar, creating dark stains that proclaimed their ability to afford sweet delicacies. This fashion was so coveted that poorer women resorted to even more dangerous methods. They would chew on iron nails until their teeth turned black, or apply mixtures of soot and animal fat to mimic the appearance of sugar-stained teeth. The irony was devastating. While the rich genuinely destroyed their teeth with expensive sweets, the poor destroyed theirs, trying to look like they could afford such luxuries. The obsession with blackened teeth reached its peak in Elizabethan England, where Queen Elizabeth herself proudly displayed her rotting teeth as symbols of her wealth and power. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in horror, describing how the Queen's smile revealed teeth black as coal, and how she seemed to take pride in their ghastly appearance. Court ladies competed to achieve the most dramatically decayed smiles, seeing healthy white teeth as a mark of peasant poverty. But teeth were just the beginning of medieval dental destruction. The wealthy also practiced deliberate tooth filing, using crude metal instruments to carve intricate patterns into their enamel. These geometric designs, often triangles or notches, were meant to catch and reflect light during conversation, turning the mouth into a grotesque display of wealth and artistic taste. The tools used for these procedures were horrifying by modern standards. Wealthy families owned sets of iron files, picks, and scrapers that were passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. The process of filing teeth was excruciating, performed without any form of pain relief, while the victim was held down by servants. Many people died from infections that followed these procedures, their mouths becoming breeding grounds for deadly bacteria. Even more disturbing was the practice of tooth transplantation. Wealthy individuals would purchase healthy teeth from the poor, having them forcibly extracted and implanted into their own rotting mouths. These grotesque operations were performed by traveling tooth merchants who carried bags of freshly pulled teeth from village to village. The procedures almost always failed, leading to horrific infections and often death. The psychological impact of these beauty standards cannot be overstated. Women learned from childhood that pain was beauty, that suffering was femininity, and that their worth was measured by their willingness to endure torture for appearance. Young girls as young as 8 were subjected to their first beauty treatments, beginning a lifetime of systematic self-destruction in pursuit of impossible ideals. Medieval beauty culture also embraced the concept of virtuous suffering. Religious leaders taught that a woman's willingness to endure pain for beauty was a reflection of her moral character and devotion to God. The more a woman suffered for her appearance, the more virtuous she was considered. This created a twisted cycle where the most extreme and dangerous beauty practices were seen as the most holy and admirable. The economic impact of these beauty standards was staggering. Families would bankrupt themselves purchasing the rare ingredients needed for cosmetics and treatments. The medieval beauty industry became a massive economic force, with entire trade routes dedicated to supplying the toxic materials needed for fashionable appearance. Merchants grew wealthy, selling lead powder, mercury compounds, and poisonous plant extracts to desperate women seeking to meet impossible standards. Perhaps most tragically, these beauty practices created a culture of competitive self-destruction. Women would secretly experiment with increasingly dangerous combinations of chemicals and procedures, each trying to outdo her peers in achieving the most fashionable look. They shared tips for creating deeper skin burns, more dramatic tooth decay, and more extreme body modifications, treating their own bodies as laboratories for ever more dangerous experiments. The medical establishment of the time not only failed to protect women from these practices, but actively encouraged them. Physicians wrote treatises on the proper methods for applying toxic cosmetics and performing dangerous procedures. They developed increasingly sophisticated tools for body modification and created detailed instructions for achieving the most extreme beauty standards, all while ignoring the mounting death toll. This systematic destruction of women's bodies was so normalized that it became invisible to medieval society. The daily application of toxic makeup, the regular use of dangerous hair treatments, and the constant pursuit of painful body modifications were simply accepted as natural parts of feminine life. No one questioned whether this suffering was necessary or whether these standards served any purpose beyond control and oppression. The legacy of medieval beauty culture extended far beyond the Middle Ages, establishing patterns of self-destruction and impossible standards that would persist for centuries. These practices laid the groundwork for a beauty industry built on insecurity, pain, and the systematic devaluation of women's natural appearance and health. Why beauty routines were strange in medieval times, Part 10. And if you thought the toxic cosmetics and dangerous beauty practices were the worst medieval women endured, we haven't even touched on the most extreme forms of body modification that were considered essential for true beauty. Because medieval society didn't just want women to paint their faces with lead and pluck their hairlines with caustic chemicals, they wanted to fundamentally reshape their entire bodies. Take tight lacing, which became an obsession among wealthy women. This wasn't just about wearing a corset. This was about systematically crushing the ribcage over months and years to achieve an impossibly tiny waist. Medieval women would have their corsets laced so tightly that their ribs would actually begin to deform, creating what we'd recognize today as severe internal organ displacement. The ideal waist measurement was considered to be around 13 to 15 inches, about the circumference of a dinner plate. Women would start this process as young as 12 years old, having their developing bodies literally molded by these contraptions. The corsets were made of whalebone, steel, and thick leather, designed to be as inflexible as possible. Servants would use special tools called lacing bars to achieve maximum tightness, often pulling so hard that women would faint from the pressure. And this wasn't just for special occasions. These corsets were worn every single day, from morning until night. The effects were catastrophic. Women's lungs were compressed to the point where they could barely breathe, leading to constant shortness of breath and fainting spells. Their digestive systems were squeezed upward, causing chronic nausea and an inability to eat normal meals. Many women survived on tiny portions of broth and bread because anything more substantial would cause excruciating pain. The compression also pushed their liver and kidneys out of position, leading to organ dysfunction that could last a lifetime. But the most disturbing part was that these physical limitations were seen as markers of refinement. A woman who could barely walk upstairs without gasping for air was considered more ladylike than one who could breathe normally. Fainting from tight lacing was actually seen as attractive. It showed you were delicate and feminine. Medical texts from the period describe women whose ribs had been compressed so severely that they developed what doctors called pigeon chest, where the breastbone protruded abnormally forward. And tight lacing was just one form of body modification. Medieval beauty standards also demanded extremely pale skin, but not just the pale skin we talked about earlier with lead cosmetics. Women would go to shocking lengths to avoid any trace of sun exposure. They would wear full face masks made of leather or cloth whenever they went outside, even in scorching heat. Some women would have their servants follow them with large parasols, creating portable shade wherever they walked. But even this wasn't enough for some. Wealthy women would actually undergo a procedure called bloodletting, specifically to make themselves appear paler. Doctors would open veins in their arms or necks and drain significant amounts of blood, believing this would create that coveted, ghostly white complexion. Women would schedule these bloodletting sessions regularly, sometimes weekly, deliberately making themselves anemic to achieve the right shade of pale. The blood loss left them weak, dizzy, and prone to fainting. But again, these were seen as desirable feminine qualities. A woman who was too robust or healthy-looking was considered coarse and unfeminine. The goal was to look as though you were perpetually on the verge of death, because apparently that was the height of beauty. Hair removal reached equally extreme levels. We mentioned the forehead plucking earlier, but medieval women would remove body hair in ways that would make modern waxing look like a gentle massage. They would use hot coals held close to the skin to burn off unwanted hair, often causing severe burns in the process. Some women would apply caustic substances made from quicklime and arsenic to dissolve hair follicles completely. One particularly horrifying practice was called sweating. Women would wrap themselves in cloths soaked in a mixture of urine, vinegar, and ground glass, then sit near intense heat sources to make themselves sweat profusely. The theory was that this would somehow purge impurities from their skin and make unwanted hair fall out. In reality, it caused chemical burns, infections, and in many cases, permanent scarring. Medieval beauty standards also demanded perfectly straight teeth, but dental care was virtually non-existent. so women would have their teeth filed down with rough metal tools to create the appearance of evenness. Many would have healthy teeth extracted and replaced with false ones made from ivory, wood, or even teeth pulled from corpses. The procedures were performed without any anesthesia, and infections were common. Many women died from dental procedures that were purely cosmetic. Perhaps most shocking of all were the scarification practices. In some medieval courts, women would deliberately create scars on their bodies in specific patterns that were considered beautiful. They would use hot irons or sharp blades to carve designs into their skin, then keep the wounds open for weeks to ensure prominent scarring. These scars were seen as permanent jewelry, a way to display wealth and status that could never be stolen or lost. The pain was considered part of the beauty. Medieval beauty manuals actually instructed women on how to endure these procedures without crying out, because showing pain was considered unladylike. Women were expected to suffer in silence while their bodies were systematically damaged in the name of attractiveness. And here's what makes this even more disturbing. These weren't rare practices performed by a few eccentric individuals. These were mainstream beauty standards that most women felt pressured to follow. Medical texts from the period show that doctors not only approved of these practices, but actively encouraged them. They wrote detailed instructions on proper bloodletting techniques for cosmetic purposes and recommended the most effective caustic substances for hair removal. The church, too, played a role in promoting these practices. Many religious texts suggested that women had a moral obligation to make themselves as beautiful as possible for their husbands, even if it meant enduring physical suffering. Pain was seen as a form of purification, and women who underwent these procedures were sometimes praised for their virtue and dedication. What's most chilling is reading the personal accounts of women from this period. Letters and diary entries describe the daily agony of tight lacing as something they simply accepted as part of being female. They write about the burning pain of caustic hair removal treatments and the weakness from regular bloodletting as though these were just normal aspects of their beauty routines. One medieval noblewoman's diary describes her preparation for her wedding day. Weeks of bloodletting to achieve the perfect pallor, having her teeth filed and several extracted, undergoing scarification on her arms and shoulders, and being laced so tightly into her corset that she could barely stand. She describes fainting multiple times during the ceremony and being unable to eat for days afterward due to the compression of her organs. But she also writes about how proud she felt to have achieved the ideal standard of beauty, even though it left her permanently damaged. This wasn't seen as abuse or self-harm. It was seen as the ultimate expression of femininity and social status. The most tragic part is that many of these practices caused permanent disability. Women who spent years in tight-laced corsets often developed spinal deformities that left them hunched and unable to stand straight. The organ displacement could cause lifelong digestive problems and breathing difficulties. The caustic hair removal treatments frequently resulted in nerve damage and loss of sensation in affected areas. Yet these practices persisted for centuries because they were so deeply embedded in medieval ideas about beauty, virtue, and social status. A woman who refused to undergo these procedures was seen as rebellious, unfeminine, and morally suspect. The pressure to conform was enormous, especially for women who wanted to marry well or maintain their position in society. This gives us a window into just how twisted medieval beauty standards really were. These weren't just about looking good. They were about demonstrating your willingness to suffer for society's expectations. Beauty became a form of endurance test, where the ability to withstand pain and physical damage was seen as the ultimate feminine virtue. And the truly disturbing part is that these practices were passed down from mother to daughter as though they were normal parts of growing up. Young girls would watch their mothers undergo these procedures and accept them as their inevitable future. The cycle of suffering continued generation after generation because it was so normalized that few people questioned whether it was necessary or healthy. This systematic approach to bodily modification in the name of beauty represents perhaps the darkest aspect of medieval life for women. It shows us a society where female bodies were seen as raw material, to be shaped and molded according to male fantasies and social expectations, regardless of the human cost. These weren't just beauty routines. They were forms of socially sanctioned self-harm that left women disabled, disfigured, and often dead. But they were so deeply embedded in medieval culture that they were seen as not just normal, but necessary for any woman who wanted to be considered truly beautiful. Why beauty routines were strange in medieval times. Part 11. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval beauty culture wasn't just the dangerous substances or painful procedures. It was how deeply these practices became woven into the fabric of identity itself. Beauty wasn't simply about looking attractive. It was about proving your worth as a human being, demonstrating your moral character, and securing your very survival in a world that offered few alternatives for women especially. The psychological toll of these beauty standards created a generational cycle of suffering that would persist for centuries. Mothers who had endured lead poisoning and mercury treatments would pass these same practices down to their daughters, genuinely believing they were teaching them essential life skills. Young girls would watch their mothers apply toxic cosmetics and undergo painful procedures, learning that beauty required sacrifice, that to be worthy of love, marriage, or social acceptance, they must be willing to harm themselves. Consider the tragic case of Isabella de Fortibus, a 13th century English noblewoman whose beauty regimen was meticulously documented by her household accounts. Isabella spent enormous sums on cosmetics containing white lead, mercury-based rouge, and arsenic compounds. Her daily routine included hours of tight lacing that left permanent grooves in her ribcage, bloodletting sessions to maintain her fashionable pallor, and chemical treatments to remove every trace of body hair. By age 30, Isabella exhibited classic signs of heavy metal poisoning: tremors, memory loss, and neurological damage. Yet she continued these practices until her death at 35, because stopping would have meant social suicide in her world. The normalization of suffering as beauty created a bizarre cognitive dissonance where the very symptoms of poisoning were often interpreted as signs of refinement. The trembling hands caused by mercury exposure were seen as delicate femininity. The pale, wan complexion of lead poisoning was the height of aristocratic beauty. The weakness and fatigue from bloodletting were viewed as proof of a lady's gentle, otherworldly nature. Women literally dying from their beauty routines were praised for achieving the perfect aesthetic ideal. This twisted logic extended to the male perception of female beauty as well. Men of the medieval period often expressed preference for women who appeared fragile, ethereal, and otherworldly, qualities that were frequently the result of chronic poisoning and malnutrition from extreme beauty practices. The beautiful invalid became a romantic ideal, with pale, weak women who could barely stand being considered the pinnacle of feminine attractiveness. This created a feedback loop where women felt compelled to make themselves genuinely ill to achieve the desired aesthetic. The economic exploitation surrounding these beauty practices was equally disturbing. Merchants and apothecaries grew wealthy, selling toxic substances to desperate women, often marketing the most dangerous ingredients as the most effective. Lead-based cosmetics were significantly more expensive than safer alternatives, creating a system where the deadliest products were also status symbols. Women would bankrupt their families purchasing arsenic-laden face powders and mercury-based rouge, believing that these costly toxins were worth any price for beauty. Religious authorities played a complex and often contradictory role in these practices. While the church officially condemned vanity and excessive attention to physical appearance, it simultaneously promoted ideals of female purity and perfection that could only be achieved through extreme measures. The Virgin Mary was depicted with impossibly pale skin, hairless arms, and a tiny waist, images that required real women to use lead paint, undergo painful hair removal, and tight lace to the point of organ damage to emulate. This created a spiritual justification for self-harm, as women believed they were making themselves more worthy of divine favor through their suffering. The medical establishment of the time provided no protection against these dangerous practices. In fact, physicians often prescribed and administered the very treatments that were slowly killing their patients. Bloodletting was considered essential for maintaining health and beauty, with doctors recommending regular sessions that would leave patients weak and anemic. Mercury was prescribed for everything from skin conditions to reproductive health, with physicians believing it purified the blood and enhanced beauty. The line between medicine and cosmetics was virtually non-existent, with the same toxic substances being used for both purposes. Perhaps most tragically, the children of women who underwent these beauty treatments often suffered the consequences as well. Lead and mercury poisoning could affect developing fetuses, leading to birth defects, developmental delays, and infant mortality. Many medieval women who achieved the perfect pale complexion through lead-based cosmetics struggled with fertility issues, miscarriages, and sickly children. Yet they rarely connected these problems to their beauty routines, instead seeing them as divine punishment for their vanity. The social enforcement of these beauty standards was relentless and unforgiving. Women who refused to conform to dangerous beauty practices faced social ostracism, reduced marriage prospects, and economic hardship. In a society where a woman's value was largely determined by her appearance and her ability to secure a beneficial marriage, choosing health over beauty was often not a realistic option. This created a form of collective coercion, where entire communities participated in normalizing and enforcing practices that were literally killing their members. The legacy of these medieval beauty practices extended far beyond the Middle Ages, establishing patterns of thought that would influence beauty standards for centuries to come. The idea that beauty requires suffering, that women must harm themselves to be worthy of love, and that extreme measures are justified in the pursuit of an idealized appearance. These concepts became so deeply embedded in cultural consciousness that echoes of them persist even today. Understanding this dark chapter of history reveals how beauty standards have always been about more than simple aesthetics. They've been tools of social control, economic exploitation, and psychological manipulation. The women who endured these torturous routines weren't vain or foolish. They were trapped in a system that offered them no other path to security, respect, or survival. Their suffering serves as a powerful reminder of how societies can normalize the most extreme forms of self-harm when they become associated with social acceptance and success. As we examine these historical practices, we see not just the evolution of beauty standards, but the profound ways in which cultural values, economic systems, and power structures can conspire to convince people that harming themselves is not only acceptable, but necessary. The medieval obsession with toxic beauty treatments reveals the dangerous extremes to which human beings will go when their society tells them that their natural appearance is fundamentally unacceptable and that achieving impossible standards is worth any cost, even their lives. The toxic substances used in medieval beauty routines weren't limited to cosmetics alone. The pursuit of the coveted pale complexion drove women to even more dangerous extremes. Many would deliberately infect themselves with parasites, believing that the resulting illness would create the fashionable gaunt, ethereal appearance. Tapeworms were intentionally consumed, as the resulting malnutrition and weight loss were seen as desirable beauty effects. The irony was cruel. In an age where food was scarce and starvation common, the wealthy deliberately starved themselves in the name of beauty. The practice of bloodletting extended beyond medical treatment into the realm of beauty maintenance. Women would have their blood drained regularly, believing it would maintain their pale complexion and prevent the dreaded ruddy glow of good health. These bloodletting sessions often left women weak, anemic, and susceptible to infection, but the temporary pallor was deemed worth the risk. Some women would have specific veins opened in their temples or wrists, creating permanent scarring that became yet another mark of their dedication to beauty standards. Perhaps most disturbing was the practice of deliberate poisoning for cosmetic purposes. Small doses of arsenic were consumed regularly, as the poison created a translucent, almost luminous quality to the skin that was highly prized. Women who survived this practice often developed a tolerance to arsenic, requiring increasingly larger doses to maintain the effect. The long-term consequences were devastating. Organ failure, neurological damage, and eventual death were common outcomes. But the immediate beauty benefits were considered worth the ultimate price. The manipulation of body shape reached horrifying extremes through the use of corsets and binding devices. Young girls, some as young as 3 or 4 years old, were fitted with iron corsets that would gradually reshape their developing rib cages and internal organs. These devices were tightened daily, sometimes to the point where breathing became labored and eating was nearly impossible. The goal was to achieve the impossibly narrow waist that measured no more than 13 inches, a measurement that could only be achieved through years of systematic organ displacement and rib compression. The feet were another target for painful modification. Following trends that originated in other cultures, some European women began binding their feet to prevent growth and create the tiny, delicate appearance that was fashionable. This practice, though less common than in other parts of the world, still left many women permanently disabled, unable to walk without assistance, and suffering from chronic pain and infection from the deliberate deformation of their bones. Hair modification went beyond simple styling to include permanent alteration of the hairline and scalp. Women would pluck not just their hairlines, but entire sections of their scalp to create dramatically high foreheads. The process was agonizing and often led to permanent baldness, scarring, and infection. Some women used caustic chemicals to burn away unwanted hair, leaving their scalps damaged and their remaining hair brittle and prone to falling out in clumps. The teeth were subjected to equally brutal treatments in the name of beauty. Black teeth were fashionable in some periods, achieved by deliberately allowing teeth to rot or by applying corrosive substances that would stain and weaken the enamel. Some women would have their healthy teeth filed into points or deliberately loosened to create gaps that were considered attractive. The resulting dental problems caused chronic pain, difficulty eating, and frequent infections that could spread throughout the body. Scarification and deliberate wound creation were practiced to achieve certain beauty ideals. Women would cut intricate patterns into their skin, allowing the wounds to heal into raised scars that formed decorative designs. These cuts were often made with unsterilized instruments and treated with substances that would ensure prominent scarring. The risk of infection was enormous, and many women died from sepsis following these voluntary mutilations. The pursuit of specific eye colors led to the use of dangerous substances that could cause permanent blindness. Belladonna, a highly toxic plant, was dropped directly into the eyes to dilate the pupils and create the wide-eyed, dreamy expression that was fashionable. The substance was so poisonous that women often experienced hallucinations, seizures, and heart palpitations. But the temporary beauty effect was considered worth the risk of permanent damage or death. Skin bleaching reached levels of toxicity that were staggering even by medieval standards. Women would bathe in solutions containing mercury, lead, and other heavy metals, believing that prolonged exposure would lighten their skin. These baths often lasted for hours, allowing the toxic substances to be absorbed through the skin and into the bloodstream. The cumulative effect of these treatments was devastating. organ failure, neurological damage, and slow, painful death were common outcomes. The creation of artificial beauty marks involved deliberately burning or cutting the skin to create permanent marks in fashionable locations. These wounds were often infected intentionally to create more prominent scarring, and women would rub various substances into the cuts to alter their color and texture. The risk of serious infection was enormous, but the social pressure to conform to beauty standards made even this extreme practice seem reasonable. Perhaps most tragic was the normalization of suffering in the name of beauty. Young girls were taught from infancy that pain was the price of attractiveness, that their worth as human beings was directly tied to their willingness to endure physical agony for the sake of appearance. Mothers would begin these practices on their daughters as soon as they could walk, ensuring that the cycle of self-destruction continued from generation to generation. The medical establishment of the time not only failed to discourage these practices, but often actively promoted them. Physicians would prescribe toxic substances and painful procedures as legitimate beauty treatments, lending the authority of medical science to practices that were essentially forms of torture. The lack of understanding about human anatomy and physiology meant that even well-intentioned medical advice often resulted in permanent damage or death. Religious authorities also played a role in perpetuating these dangerous beauty standards. The emphasis on suffering as a path to spiritual purity meant that the pain endured in pursuit of beauty was often seen as virtuous. Women who suffered greatly for their appearance were praised for their dedication and self-sacrifice, creating a cultural framework that glorified self-destruction in the name of beauty. The economic aspects of these beauty practices created entire industries built on human suffering. Merchants made fortunes selling toxic cosmetics and dangerous beauty devices, while physicians profited from treating the inevitable consequences of their use. The beauty industry was literally built on the bodies of women who paid the ultimate price for conforming to impossible standards. The psychological impact of these practices was equally devastating. Women lived in constant fear of aging, of losing their beauty, of failing to meet the impossible standards set by society. The pressure to maintain their appearance often drove them to increasingly desperate measures, creating a cycle of addiction to pain and suffering that defined their entire existence. Many women reported feeling as though they had no identity beyond their physical appearance, no worth beyond their ability to endure torture in the name of beauty. The social isolation that resulted from beauty-related injuries and disabilities was another cruel consequence of these practices. Women who were disfigured or disabled by beauty treatments often found themselves ostracized from society, unable to marry or participate in social activities. The very practices that were supposed to make them more attractive often left them hideous and alone, rejected by the society they had sacrificed everything to please. The intergenerational trauma caused by these beauty practices cannot be overstated. Mothers who had suffered through these treatments often felt compelled to inflict the same suffering on their daughters, unable to break the cycle of abuse that had defined their own lives. The normalization of pain and suffering created families where love was expressed through the infliction of agony, where caring for a child meant subjecting them to torture. The medical complications from these beauty practices were both immediate and long-lasting. Women suffered from chronic pain, organ failure, neurological damage, and countless other health problems that made their daily lives a constant struggle. Many were unable to bear children due to the damage inflicted on their bodies, while others passed on genetic damage to their offspring, ensuring that the consequences of their beauty practices would affect future generations. The death toll from these practices was staggering, though often hidden or attributed to other causes. Women who died from lead poisoning were said to have succumbed to melancholy, while those who died from mercury exposure were claimed by madness. The true cost of medieval beauty standards was deliberately obscured, allowing the practices to continue unchallenged for centuries. As we reflect on these horrific practices, we must remember that they were not the result of ignorance or lack of education, but rather the inevitable consequence of a society that valued women's appearance above their lives, their health, their happiness, and their humanity. These were not primitive people who didn't know better. These were individuals caught in a system that demanded their suffering as the price of acceptance, that normalized torture as the cost of love, and that made self-destruction seem like the only path to worth and meaning. The legacy of these medieval beauty practices serves as a stark reminder of how quickly society can normalize the most extreme forms of suffering when they serve the interests of power and control. The women who endured these tortures were not willing participants in their own destruction. They were victims of a system that gave them no choice but to suffer or be rejected, to torture themselves or be deemed worthless. Today, as we look back on these dark chapters of human history, we must ask ourselves what practices we currently accept as normal, that future generations will view with the same horror and disbelief. The capacity for societies to normalize extreme suffering in the name of beauty, status, or conformity has not disappeared. It has simply taken new forms that we may not yet recognize as the torture they truly are. The medieval period stands as a testament to the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance, showing us how far people will go to meet impossible standards, and how much suffering they will accept as normal when it becomes woven into the fabric of their culture. These women's stories are not just historical curiosities, they are warnings about the dangers of allowing appearance to matter more than humanity, beauty to matter more than health, and conformity to matter more than life itself. In remembering their suffering, we honor not only their memory, but also our responsibility to ensure that such systematic destruction of human beings in the name of beauty never again becomes normalized, accepted, or celebrated as it was in those dark medieval times when pain was beauty, and beauty was worth any price, even life itself.